Well, it's day 5 of the trial. Lori-Vallow Daybell accused of conspiracy to commit murder. And today, the state rested its case against the defendant. And as we predicted yesterday, Erica, she herself did not present any witnesses. And so the defense also rested. That means that this case is now in the hands of the jury. But that wasn't right. That wasn't without, though. That doesn't mean that nothing happened today in court. There was a lot that happened and a lot that we have to get to here inside the courtroom. So we're glad that you're here with us. So, Erica, this morning, we knew we had one more witness to go. Who took the stand this morning?
Yes, one more witness to go. So it was FBI Special Agent Nicholas Bounds. And I do want to let people know their jury does have this case, but we are not expecting a verdict tonight. That jury went home. That's the biggest news, I think, of the day, is that they, got the case soon after and made some decision. We don't know whether or not there was any brief deliberation. It happened just before around 2:42, 2:43 local time here, right after the closing arguments ended. And soon after, by 3 o'clock, I was calling the newsroom saying, okay, do you want me to come back? We're done. They're done for the day. They're coming back tomorrow. So that's essentially where we left off in court today. But as you said, Andrea, it was a jam-packed day. Once again, day 5. And honestly, I'll point out that they're on track with their original schedule. I know there was some concerns from the state about the delays and, maybe taking some witnesses in a different order, but we'll get to her closing arguments in just a moment. But Prosecutor Trina Kay, I think, did a really, really good job of looping everyone back in. And, the witnesses she ended on, I think, were some of the strongest witnesses that she had. So this morning, it was FBI Special Agent Nicholas Bounds. We could not show his face due to the nature of his work, but he essentially, and I'll walk through this quickly so we can get to, some of those closing statements, because those were truly, truly interesting to witness inside the courtroom. But his testimony essentially revolved around cell towers and cell phone data. So he was able to essentially place devices belonging to Alex Cox, Lori Vallow in Idaho, at the Walmart where they got the track phone, the storage unit, kind of, again, using cell tower data, really getting into the details with the jury there. A lot of them looking on very attentively. I would imagine that's, it can be a bit dry to some people, but if you're really focused on how does this tie into this case, I think they were trying to do a good job of laying that out, make sure everyone would understand that. And the other big piece that we learned from him is that this track phone that was linked to a Gmail account belonging to Alex Cox, that's Lori-Vallow Daybell's brother, was in Arizona at the time of the alleged shooting at Brandon Boudreaux. And it was hitting the cell towers by his niece Melanie Boudreaux's house, by Brandon Boudreaux's house. So really a lot of interesting stuff here. And for those of you who are like, who are all these people? What are these names? I'll circle back to all of this. It's Lori-Vallow Daybell, accused of conspiring to kill her niece's ex-husband. That's Brandon Boudreaux. Part of the conspiracy is her brother, Alex Cox, who we believe is the trigger man. That's what all the evidence is supporting, according to the state here. And he's dead, so he cannot be charged in this case. And we learn as the state goes through her closing arguments that there are certainly other co-conspirators here, but it's Lori-Vallow Daybell, the one that is on trial right now. So that's essentially where we got to. That's, the nutshell, I guess, leading up to the closing arguments. And, Trina Kay started off, I think she really wanted to play out the timeline for people. So she walked through her timeline, that late September 2019, early October 2019, really laying out every piece of evidence that she has, which includes, different witness testimony. People who, Brandon Boudreaux's testimony saying he saw, there was a bullet in his car and he, heard this bang and his window shattered. So his whole experience, really the crux of all of this here. And then there's that cell phone data, there's surveillance footage. And really, she tried to put it together in a bow, Andrea. But then, as we've seen before, this is Lori-Vallow Daybell. She's someone who is representing herself for the second time in a trial here in Arizona. So we had some idea of what to expect, but this was, her closing statements were really, really interesting today. They were very short, and we're going to play them all out for you here. We'll start with part 1 in just a moment. But I want to say that people were kind of snickering at her at some points in time in the gallery. Interesting to see how the jury, was handling that. She was objected to multiple times. So let's just get right into it. And I'm curious to see your reaction too, Andrea. So let's take a listen to the first part of her closing statements.
When a family breaks apart, it is a tragedy, with the devastation far-reaching affecting many people. I am not exempt from tragedy, none of us are. But what we learn from it is most important. Because of this experience, I've studied the law and the judicial system, and that knowledge will stay with me forever. When we experience tragedy, we can grow stronger from the experiences, and then those experiences are not all negative. You would think that often people in my position would feel defensive or angry, and from where I'm standing, I understand that very well. But I don't feel any of those things. You have watched me under pressure, under scrutiny, and even under attack. And I have shown you that I'm not on any of those things.
I'm going to object to character evidence and testimony that's not in
Sustained.
evidence.
Ms. Daybell, could I have you pull that microphone a little closer, please?
You can't be upset with people who are forced to look at your life from a distance or judge it through a lens that's being intentionally distorted or being at least very limited. Like the lens the state has shown you on this event. There's so much more going on that is not included to your view. The law prevents some of these things from being shared
I'm
in
going to
trial.
object, Your Honor, to improper.
Sustained.
You have seen opinions formed by strangers trying to put together a narrative. I have shown you that basically there is no defense to what a person did not do or did not participate in. Other than what you've seen, which is no evidence that I made an agreement to commit a crime, because no such evidence exists. So I'm not defensive, I'm not angry. Nobody has all the pieces to this puzzle. It is complex. Like most families, this is a complex issue. And like the state, I was not there. But there is no agreement, no plan, no game. I am no stranger to tragedy. The breaking up of a family is tragedy. On June 25th, 2019, Brandon Boudreau decided that I was responsible for his family tragedy. And I'm really sorry that he feels that way.
No, Your Honor, I'm going to object again to testimony.
All right. The jury is reminded that what is said in closing statements or closing arguments is not evidence, it is not testimony. The intent of the closing argument is for each side to argue what the evidence shows. Go ahead.
So this is difficult to watch, and I can only imagine, again, with maybe not for the jurors, but for the people in the gallery who know the full story. Every time this defendant kind of walks down that path of this is my, it's tragedy, I'm a part of a tragedy, this is a family tragedy. She's used that line multiple times in multiple different contexts, almost to imply that she's a victim here. I can't even fathom how that lands, especially in the gallery.
Yeah.
So,
and
is that
as
what
I said,
did people respond to that? Yeah.
Yeah, Andrea, and I think it's hard with all the objections too. And first let's, I'll go to the gallery first because Brandon Boudreau has been in the courtroom day in, day out. He was the state's first witness. He testified in this case. And yeah, I can imagine it's extremely tough. He disclosed on the stand during his testimony how painful it was to go through a divorce with his ex-wife and the impact that could have on the children and how he testified that ultimately it was Lori-Vallow Daybell who was putting ideas in his wife's head that, ultimately was the beginning of the unraveling of his marriage, is what he said. And she, it's interesting because, and of course, she's defending herself. She is innocent until proven guilty. And the burden here is on the state. But the way she talks about a tragedy, I agree with you, Andrea, is that she's not caused anything that has happened around her, is essentially the vibe that she is trying to exude here. And it is hard. And, there are other people in the courtroom. Kay Woodcock was in there today, too. She's the sister of Charles Vallow. That's Lori-Vallow Daybell's former husband, who she was convicted of trying to kill, her murder conspiracy. Back in April here in Arizona, Charles Vallow died. He was shot by Alex Cox back in July 2019, so before Brandon Boudreau was shot. And parts of that case made their way into this case. And, it's tough because she used the same line in her closing arguments in that case, that this is just a family tragedy. And, you know, just to give everyone the complete backstory here, Kay Woodcock, not only Charles Vallow's sister, but the grandmother to JJ Vallow, Lori Vallow Daybell's adopted son, and her daughter, Tylee Ryan, both of them are dead. They were killed back in September 2019. That's when investigators believe they were killed. She was convicted in Idaho for killing them, as well as Tammy Daybell, Chad Daybell's first wife. So it's just this long list of people. And time and time again, we just hear her say, this was a tragedy. Something happened around my family. And yes, it is sad. And I don't know how well that lands.
I can't fathom that it lands well at all. And especially considering that it almost, again, turns it around. It makes no statement about the evidence presented, nothing to dispute that, which, as the judge pointed out, this is not the time to present evidence or testimony. However, this really, again, back to the things that she brings up, it's irrelevant. In a lot of ways, this isn't relevant to the case as it was presented, because what she's trying to say is that Brandon Boudreaux, I think what she's implying is that because he thought she was responsible for his divorce, now he has somehow targeted her and named her as the person potentially involved. We know that that's not why this case came about. This case didn't come about because Brandon dropped her name to police. That started the investigation, or that led police in her direction perhaps, but it's the evidence and all of the testimony that we've heard for the last 5 days. That is the reason that she is charged with this crime. And so even if that were to be true, even if that Brandon was mad at her and so he gave police her name, that doesn't answer for all of the facts that we have seen presented in all of the evidence. So back to, I'm not sure what she's trying to do there, but when she talks about a family tragedy, for those people that are sitting in that room, like Brandon and Kay, I can only imagine how hurtful that is, because there has definitely been a tragedy here. There is an extensive, heinous family tragedy, but it is not the defendant's tragedy. She's been a part of it, but she is not the victim of the tragedy.
No, and the state is arguing that she's responsible for it as well. And,
sure, exactly.
It's true. And I think you hit the nail on the head, Andrea, is that Vallow Daybell is trying to come off as a victim, even though she can't directly say that to the jury. But as we saw, she does say a lot to the jury, and she gets objected to a lot. And as I said, that was just the first portion of her closing argument today. We'll play the next part in just a second, but I want to make sure everyone's paying attention because there were multiple objections this time as well. And it just, again, you wonder how this lands and how this looks for the jury. And as I said, I'll give you some insight on what the gallery was doing as, she continued down her path. So take a listen.
I did and have supported my niece Melanie when she suffered tragedy as a young child and during this terribly difficult time in 2019. We read the text from Brandon to me on June 25th, 2019, where he claims that he will never stop until he proves that I am responsible. Well, here we are, almost 6 years later, and I'm charged with conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. In order to have a conspiracy, 2 or more people have to make an agreement to commit a crime. There is no such agreement between me and my brother Alex, although I did love my brother Alex.
And I'm going to object again, Your Honor, to testifying.
Sustained.
There is no agreement that was shown to you between myself and Melanie Boudreaux, although I love Melanie.
And I'm going to object again to testifying.
Sustained.
I cannot tell you what happened that day on October 2nd, 2019, because I was not there.
And I'm going to again object to testifying, and please strike everything the defendant has said.
All right. The defendant is admonished, you cannot argue things that were not admitted into evidence.
The prosecutor wasn't there. Law enforcement wasn't there. Only Brandon knows what happened before he called 911. Only Brandon said he will not stop. The fact that I supported Melanie in her time of need does not make me against Brandon. I had nothing to gain by Brandon being hurt. Brandon has worked with law enforcement for almost 6 years to make sure that I pay a consequence.
I'm going to object to misstating the evidence.
Sustained. The jury will determine what the evidence did and did not show.
Your job is to determine if I committed a crime, this crime, a conspiracy, an agreement, not cleaning out a garage, but an agreement to commit murder. You did not see an agreement. You did not hear an agreement. You heard Detective Duncan say that he had spent hundreds of hours going over my iCloud accounts. They have 19 years of my accounts, text messages,
And I'm going to object to
calls.
misstates the evidence and no.
If there was an agreement.
Hold on. The objection sustained. The jury is reminded that they will determine what the evidence did and did not show. Go ahead.
If there was an agreement, they would have showed it to you. There is no agreement. We've all experienced tragedies in our lives, and naturally people want someone to blame, someone to pay a price. My brother is no longer here. We can't ask him about that day. There were things presented in this case that I did not know.
And I'm going to object again to testifying, Your Honor, and ask to strike.
Sustained.
Things that I saw, I thought,
And again, I'm going to already ask to strike.
All right. The defendant cannot testify to things that were not testified to from the witness stand.
because this is the theory the prosecutor wants you to see, it is limited. How can we say clearly when the law only allows for a skewed view of things? The devastation this family has gone through is the tragedy. After almost 6 years, it's time for healing.
So that's another line she's used before. It's time for healing. That's a mess. That
Yeah.
was a mess of a closing argument, and it just is. It's almost difficult to watch. I mean, difficult to listen to and to sit through. Again, knowing all that we know, and it just doesn't. There's no value there, and I cannot fathom. I mean, what else does she have to do it? But if I agree to help someone move, do we sign a written agreement? Is there proof of that? You know, I mean, other than maybe a text message that says, hey, you want to come over? But we know they were using burner phones. We know they were using other means, right, of communication. And so I can't imagine the jury expects there to be, I don't think that that's any piece of evidence or any piece of information that's going to be valuable to a jury. So do I think that works?
Well, and I think, Andrea,
No.
she's so literal too. And, kind of gives off the vibe that, well, law enforcement wasn't there. I wasn't there. Only Brandon knows what happened. And Brandon, if you look at it from a different perspective, Brandon told police what happened. He told the jury what happened. And for her to suggest that, it just, I feel like she's the one looking at things through a different lens, it feels like. And again, that's what she said the state is doing to her, and not able to see the full picture and skewing things. And it is a bit puzzling to see this because, again, as people who have covered this case and the series of cases for the past 5+ years, we know that the more to the story is that she has convictions in 2 other cases, including the murders of her children. And it just, I don't know what she could possibly want to introduce or bring in that would suggest anything that could help her, honestly.
Right. Exactly. Well, and I think she has nothing. And so then, I guess maybe then that is where I say perhaps I shouldn't be surprised at the approach, because what else does she have? The only thing she has is to say, poor me, you have it wrong. Right? Wasn't me. And you can't prove I was there because there is no black and white evidence that says she was there. We do know, we have seen evidence of her carrying that tire and her carrying the Jeep, what appears to be a bench seat, very similar to what would have come out of that Jeep, as they alleged. The one that Alex Cox was said to be driving, to be inside, the one that he was said to have fired from at Brandon Boudreaux. So we know that connects her. We also know she's connected through the alibi, the attempt to create an alibi. We believe that she actively created phone calls and kept Alex Cox's phone with her in order to make it appear that he was in Idaho and not in Arizona at the time of the shooting. That connects her directly. And then we also have the right, and we have, I mean, those are the big pieces of information that we know that we have. But we also know, and as we have seen, now remember back here in Idaho, she was convicted of the conspiracy to commit murder against Chad Daybell's wife, right? Ex-wife or former wife, the one that that he is accused of killing and convicted of killing. And so we know in that case there was a conviction. No black and white evidence, nothing to prove that she conspired. In her last conspiracy to commit murder trial of her fourth husband, Charles Vallow, also no written agreement, nothing in writing that said we have a pact. We're going to kill him.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And yet there's a conviction
and
there.
I think,
so she knows that, right? She knows that as well as we do.
Well, I think, again, it's just her efforts to try and cast any sort of doubt that she can, because the state, when we'll get to her rebuttal to all that Lori just said in just a moment, but the state has laid out that, we don't need to show you an agreement for there to be a conspiracy. We can show you all the pieces and you have to look at it holistically. But before we get to the state's rebuttal, and we'll break down her closing arguments further after that, I want to ask Andrea, because not only was the content of Vallow Daybell's closing argument thin, I would say, as you're saying, not much meat to it, all the objections, obviously, it seems like some of the things the judge was saying was in one ear and out the other. There was one point where she's saying, and I loved my brother Alex, and he said, and they said, can't testify to that, sustained. And she goes right on to say, and I love my niece Melody. Like, she does the same thing within seconds. It's as if she didn't clock what the judge had just admonished her. So how do you think those interjections, we'll say, land with a jury watching this all unfold?
I think the word I used was a mess. I mean, it felt like a mess. I think it's very difficult to follow the train of thought. I think that it is obvious she's not following the rules of the court. I think that it is, she almost seems defiant. And of course, we will never know. That this will be a question that I will ask about this defendant specifically, probably forever. Does she understand what she's doing? Does she believe the things that she is saying? Or is this all just part of the act, or, part of her attempt to manipulate? And I think the same thing is, does she understand? Does she comprehend that what you're doing is exactly what he just told you not to do? Are you doing this on purpose? Are you being defiant, or are you confused, right?
Yeah, and it's tough because there's so much of what she says that is lucid. Like, she's obviously talking about the case at hand. She's listening to testimony. We saw her on cross-examination ask very specific questions about things that were testified to, about things that were in, the deep end of police reports and things like that. So you can tell she has some sense of what is going on. But when you see that unfold in front of the judge, when she has to be told time and time again, and, she said at the beginning, I want to say, she has, she studied the law, is what she said. And maybe you have time to do that when you've been incarcerated for the past 5+ years and, have been preparing for defenses in 3 different criminal trials. So, it's certainly very interesting. And but I don't know.
Also,
and
to
I would,
what end?
To what end? And if we do, I'll put in, we've tried to put in requests to interview her since she's been here at the Estrella jail in Maricopa County, Arizona, and have not been able to get in. So if there is ever an opportunity, that I think your questions, Andrea, and then why is probably why any of this would be my top question. So perhaps we'll get a chance to do that one day. But at this point, we're still moving on with trial number 3, which again has no convictions at this point, cases with the jury. And let's move on to the state's rebuttal. Thinking back to the trial of her last murder conspiracy trial in Arizona, the death of Charles Vallow, as you said, her 4th husband, we saw something similar where the state laid out their case. Lori comes up, says it's a tragedy, and then Trina Kay, the prosecutor, almost flew out of her seat and was like, this is not a tragedy. And she really drove home the point for the jurors. They, as the state has the burden of proof, they can open and end the closing arguments, and that's what she opted to do today. And I will say it was similar vibes to her last trial, where she comes up and she was fiery. So take a listen.
The defendant wants you to think that Brandon has it out for her. She has tried to insinuate that Brandon was involved with working with Detective Pillar for years just to get her. But what you heard was that Brandon has actually been working with law enforcement on multiple investigations, and that in fact Melanie Boudreau is a subject of multiple investigations. So again, as the defendant sits up here and tries to portray and paint a picture for you of her innocence and sadness and family tragedy, she again misrepresents what was told to you at trial. She tells you there was no plan, but she ignores the facts and the evidence of a very obvious long plan. A plan that started when she began, this defendant, Lori Vallow, meddling in Melanie and Brandon's marriage. And when that marriage was finally ending, this defendant continued to help her niece, Melanie. She continued to aid her. And what we see in every one of these bits of evidence is a core group of people. This defendant, her brother Alex, Melanie Boudreau, and Chad Daybell. The four of them working together. Do we need to have words, a video? No, we do not. That is why there is that jury instruction on direct and circumstantial evidence, because you look at what is going on here, and it screams to you a conspiracy by this defendant, by Melanie Boudreau, by Alex Cox, and by Chad Daybell to kill Brandon Boudreau. Every action you see there, the defendant would like you to look at them individually and pretend that they don't all point to what happened on October 2nd. But everything they did leading up to then shows you a way to cover up and prepare for the murder of Brandon Boudreau. When we talk about a plan and this defendant's actions, the most obvious and screaming piece of information is this defendant holding on to her brother's phone for days, holding on to the 480-351-9120 number for days while her brother is gone, with her Jeep, without the rear tire, without the back seat, with a gun with him. That is part of the plan. That is the assisting, that is the promoting, that is the conspiracy that this defendant wants you to pretend doesn't exist. We don't need words. We have actions that are obvious, and they're done by this defendant and her co-conspirators. The state asks you to look at everything together, regardless of how many people want to cry up here, regardless of how many people want to try to testify. This is not evidence. What is evidence is what was presented to you in trial, and each piece of that tells you this defendant is guilty. And so I ask you to find her guilty of the conspiracy to commit murder against Brandon Boudreau. Thank you.
And that's how she ended the day, right? That is what the jury is left with before they go into deliberation or before they break in order to consider this case. That's powerful.
Yeah, I would agree, Andrea. And we've, seen this happen before, even with, the state's direct examination, then cross-examination, then Trina K on redirect. Her ability to be able to circle back on things, I think, is almost more compelling sometimes than
Agreed.
her initial presentation. And I think that's what we saw today. And I think that's also on the heels of listening to Lori Vallow,
Yes.
call this a tragedy, call another instance where she's being charged with a crime just a family tragedy. And I think you can sense just how frustrated and maybe how, incredulous Trina K is feeling that this defendant would suggest anything like that, because they put out all this evidence. And, you know, I think a big part of this too, Andrea, is she didn't just call out Lori-Vallow Daybell in those remarks. She mentioned Alex Cox, who we know is a big part of this. That's her brother. He can't be charged. He's dead. But we know he's been, you know, the co-conspirator in not just this case, but the death of Charles Vallow and the murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. So he's been a huge part of this. Chad Daybell also named in there. We understand charges were submitted for him, but they were not pursued by the county attorney's office here. But Melanie Boudreau is really fascinating to me. And when she was going, you know, when she was unleashing, I'll say like that, during her rebuttal, some of us in the back row there, the reporters all kind of looked at each other, you know, a bit jaw-dropping, because this is, I guess, maybe the most we've heard about Melanie's involvement in this, at least from a prosecutorial perspective. I'll say that Melanie Boudreau, who's now Melanie Pulowski, she's since remarried, she has not been charged in this in any way, but we understand throughout this trial that there is still an open investigation that she is seemingly a subject of. We don't know what will come of that. And I'll point out, Andrea, that I reached out to her attorney today. He said he had no comment on anything that was said during trial at this point. So that's where it is. But I think it was really strong language that Trina K used there. What did you make about the whole conspiracy, naming all four of them like that?
Yeah, I mean, we know that, you know, we have had hints of that. Of course, as you said in the opening statement, she talked very specifically about Alex Cox, the accused gunman, alleged gunman that they say was the reason that, you know, he was the one that fired that shot at Brandon Boudreau. And we have heard throughout the trial Melanie's name come up, sometimes because Lori herself brought it up, other times because it was just mentioned in a sense of, you know, her connection to Brandon Boudreau and where they were in their relationship and things like that. They were just days away, I believe, if not weeks away from their divorce being finalized when this happened. And so we've heard her in that context. But what is interesting is the way that she lays that out is it does beg the question. It continues to beg the question that has been asked many times before. Why is Lori-Vallow Daybell the only one that's charged in this case? So, you know, I'm very interested to see, does this eventually result in charges against Melanie? And if not, why not? Is it perhaps because there is no, Is it because there's no video of her? You know, did they somehow protect her?
We don't
even
know.
Unknowingly?
It sounds like there's still parts of this investigation that I guess what I'll say is that I think how this all unfolded in court shows that there are parts of this investigation that we do not know about. And everything from Gilbert, there's been certain things that are released, but they can't comment on this. There's a court order. They can't release any information. I think there's more layers to the onion, so to speak. And to your point, Andrea, who knows what that may result in. But there was some interesting evidence presented just this morning by the FBI agent that, made me perk up a little bit too as I'm sitting there, that involved not just Lori, her brother, and Chad, but Melanie. And we learned that I'll remember, I don't have my notes directly in front of me, but there was a call made from a device connected to Alex Cox after the shooting attempt at Brandon Boudreau to Melanie. And it was a several minute call. And that was something I hadn't heard before. And, the state really brought her into this more than I suspected. And a question in all of this too is, why was Melanie not called to testify? Perhaps it's because of this ongoing, pending investigative efforts that are going on at this point in time. But if I'm the jury, I would probably wonder, why am I not hearing from some of these people that are also named? And maybe they're wondering too, why is Lori the only one that's facing a charge in this conspiracy that, according to the prosecutor, only, has 4 people involved here? Because it was also not made clear to them. And Lori tried to mention it, but it wasn't laid out clearly to them that Alex Cox died, in what way that he died. Obviously, there was a sample taken from him to be compared for DNA. So maybe, again, piecing it together. But, I would, if I was a juror, I would probably have a lot of questions at this point in time. So that's just where we are.
Yeah,
Oh,
the
go
jury
ahead.
gets to ask those questions during evidence or during the evidentiary part, and during testimony, they are able to follow up with questions. They don't have that same opportunity after a closing statement or after the opening statement. So they are left with, because it isn't testimony and it's not information that they are supposed to consider in terms of weighing out facts in the case, but it's simply meant, just as an opening statement, it's sort of meant to remind them what they heard and remind them the way the
Yeah.
prosecution would like them to bring it all together, right? What they hope that the jury can conclude as a result of all of that evidence. And so they don't have the opportunity to ask those questions, but it would be interesting to know if they had those, if they are noticing the same things that we're noticing as we sit and watch,
Yeah.
even without all the
And
information
Andrea,
that we
I'll point
have.
out, absolutely. And I'll point out, as I said, this jury appeared to be pretty attentive for the most part. So I once saw a guy yawn. There were some different points of the trial that, different pacing as we went through the past 5 days here.
Right.
But there was one juror in particular that I kept having my eyes on because he appeared to keep looking at Brandon Boudreaux, where Brandon is sitting in the courtroom, and sometimes looking a little unnerved a little bit. And I wonder if he was just thinking about Brandon as some of this testimony, as some of these arguments are coming out. And I think that speaks to the case, or the state's case, that Brandon is a surviving victim in these allegations
Sure.
here. And he testified, and it just, how impactful do you think Brandon is to the state's case here?
Well, he certainly was, their key witness, I think. I understand the evidence being very important in terms of, piecing together where they believe that Alex Cox was, showing his movement between Arizona and Idaho, clearly very important. However, the most compelling information, certainly, and the most emotional, the human element of that Brandon brought in and was, able to walk through that and talk through that, not just in the shooting, but I think it's even difficult and challenging for the defendant to present him as being, kind of vindictive, or I don't think he presents that way at all. I think that his interactions,
No.
both when Trina Kay was talking to him and even when Lori herself was questioning him, I didn't see any of that. And so I even think that makes it difficult for the jury to buy that argument. And that's not to say he wasn't upset. I think you definitely saw his emotion, and he was frustrated and hurt by all of that. He seemed confused by what he was hearing. And certainly, he had to very, very lightly walk around what they called the incident, which we know was the shooting death of Charles Vallow. All of that, again, we have that insight, but I don't think he came across as angry or vindictive. And so I think in that way, very compelling in that he was a very sympathetic witness, I believe. And I think held his own and was very credible throughout the entire testimony.
And I'll say, I wonder if the jury, when they hear July incident, if they're, on the heels of Trina Kay saying she is the subject of multiple investigations. I think that's
Right.
also the
Yes.
most we've been able to hear regarding her past. Obviously, this jury does not know about her prior convictions, but they
Sure.
do know now that she's involved in the law in some other different ways here. And I think that's really interesting that the state went there. And as a juror, I would be wondering, okay, they keep saying July incident. They keep saying this. Lori is a subject of other investigations. I think it might not be so hard to piece a few things together there. Obviously, they don't know what the incident is about, but
Right.
if they're looking at the evidence in this case and hearing conspiracy, these people were trying to kill this person, I wonder if they are thinking, well, maybe this isn't the only time
Sure.
that something like this has occurred. But I
Yeah.
do want to bring it back, Andrea, just to, again, the impact of Brandon. And that's how the state actually started her closing argument today. I know we're a little out of order with this, but she essentially started by going through the timeline of everything that happened. But I think she opened her closing arguments really powerfully, really just driving home that this, maybe if, a bullet hit something just a few inches differently, this wouldn't be a murder conspiracy case. It could be something different. There could be a death here. So take a listen.
Who would want to kill you? That is a question that Officer Marianne Robb asked Brandon when she first arrived. That's a question that Detective Hiller asked Brandon when he spoke with him. Brandon Boudreaux gave the exact same answer to both of these officers. He gave them two names: Lori Vallow, the woman seated over here, and Alexander Cox. He told them that he believed his shooting had something to do with an incident that occurred in Chandler in July of 2019, a couple months before this. He pointed them to that. He told them that Lori Vallow had lived in Texas and that the Jeep used in this shooting was from Texas. And then he told them what happened, how he had come home that morning. This Jeep was parked unusually close to his driveway, waiting. That he noticed there was no tire on the back. That he noticed that Texas license plate. That it was a two-door Wrangler. And then he noticed that window go up. He saw the rifle come out. He saw what he believed was a silencer at the end. And then he heard and saw that bullet that hit the frame of his car, shattering the window right near his ear, causing that loud bang that he heard when that struck right near his head, mere inches away from him.
So yeah, definitely what you said, kind of in showing the impact, quite literally, but also just they call them near misses, right? I mean, that I always think that should be a near hit, but that just being so close to his head and recognizing that what was the intent there? I think she's also trying to drive home. The intent was likely not to hit just a few inches from Brandon Boudreaux's head. There's no one who believes, especially given everything that we know about this defendant's past, no one believes that that was meant to be a warning shot or some sort of, causing fear in Brandon. I don't think there's anyone who questions, given everything that we know, that was intended to kill Brandon Boudreaux. And I don't think Brandon himself probably doubts that. And so, again, you can't say that because that's not what happened, but I would imagine that's exactly what Trina Kay is thinking as she's presenting this information.
Yeah, and I think she's hoping that the jurors will believe that as well, because, that's what she, and I think there's really two parts to this, Andrea, and it is Brandon's storyline here of what happened to him and his role in this and how he became a target, according to the state. And then I think there is the evidence to support that. And even though, again, the state had to go out of order due to the delays, bringing in people from Idaho and other places, I really think that Trina Kay did a good job bringing this all together and putting a bow on everything. So it's up to the jury now. But I do think along the way, there was a lot of compelling evidence. And I think what we saw from Lori Vallow Daybell was her trying to poke holes in that evidence. And even though she spent, probably, if you add it all up, hours, I would say, throughout the course of the 5 days, cross-examining some of these witnesses. It's interesting to me because when you hear her closing argument that took around 7 minutes with no meat to it, it makes you wonder again, what is her strategy here?
Right. No, and yes. And, and then to use the example of I've studied the law, so what does that mean? And as you're being objected to 10 times in your closing statement while explaining that I know the law and I know how this works, I mean, I just think it falls very, very flat. And so it'll be interesting to see now that this case is in the hands of the jury. We don't know if they perhaps talked for a few minutes. We do know they were with that, they left the courtroom and were only together for a very short time before they got word that they would be going home for the evening, similar to what we saw in the last case. And so we know that, and it's not unusual at all for juries to take time to, we've heard that process. We've talked to jurors in the last trial about kind of what that process looked like, kind of judging where people are, what they're thinking in terms of their responsibility to decide. They have to have a unanimous verdict in order for it to be valid. There has to be a unanimous verdict. So we don't know how long this will take, but we do start counting down, right? We like to watch. We as reporters and those covering the trial always sort of keep a clock on the jury, not because we have a certain expectation, but it's interesting to see how long it takes for them to decide this. So do we think it will be quicker than the last one because we don't have quite as much evidence, because it was a little bit shorter, because we didn't have a death of someone? Or does that make it more challenging because we don't have some of that?
I don't know.
Some of that.
Watching the jury, we don't know what's going on in their minds. I can only look at, maybe some cues or when someone's looking around, but
Sure.
we don't know what the jury is thinking and what questions
Right.
they may have or what questions they may want to discuss amongst each other. And it's interesting, Andrea, because yeah, I agree. This case, I actually spoke with, we have, a legal analyst who comes on our show here at 12 News. We were texting about this earlier, and he said, I very rarely say this, but I think the state's case in this particular investigation is a slam dunk. And I think because there isn't some of the darker backstory, again, we know in the other cases there were doomsday religious beliefs. There was an obvious motive that Lori Vallow wanted to be with Chad Daybell. She wanted to get rid of everyone in her way, and she wanted to get money out of anyone she possibly could by possibly killing them. So that's, the crux of the other cases. Here, the state said they were very intentional in not including a motive because it, might confuse things, and it would also open the door to possibly bringing in Melanie and some of these other people. And again, I feel like we were teetering, we were pushing on the door a lot during some of these, remarks at the end of the day here. But it ultimately, I think that would have just been too much for the jury to really consider, and it would have delayed, it would have elongated this trial here too. So I think, again, the state did a really good job of keeping things concise, keeping things clear, even despite Lori Vallow Daybell's efforts to try and bring in some of this commentary and some of these things that could have resulted in the state bringing in her prior convictions. And she was warned about that several times. But the jury also has to, I think it doesn't surprise me that the jury didn't come back with a verdict immediately. I would imagine that even if they do have maybe a strong indication one way or another on this case, they would want to just look at everything again and go through it. And it wasn't just the state's evidence that we heard. Obviously, Vallow Daybell did not put on a case. She doesn't have to. It's the state's burden of proof. But she did bring up a lot of objections to a lot of different, or not objections, I shouldn't say, not legal objections, but she tried to cast doubt, I'll say, on a lot of different things. And I think the big one that we talked about, Andrea, was the color of the Jeep that came up again. And Trina Kay actually brought that up in her closing argument as well. And I think, again, just really trying to drive home the point that everything that this defendant, this woman, Lori Vallow Daybell, is saying, you really can't take her credibly. Take a listen.
Yeah, absolutely.
We know that at about 5:15, Lori Vallow searches how to remove the back seat of the Jeep. Alex Cox still is there, and now she is helping him get ready for his trip. She has his phone, she's giving him her Jeep, and she is helping him make it more comfortable so he can lie in wait in the back. They had to remove the tire, and they had to remove that back seat. We know that sometime that evening, Alex Cox leaves Idaho and moves towards Gilbert. We heard from Detective Pillar that there was an LPR reading for that Texas license plate LWD 0997 at around 8:10 outside of Rexburg, Idaho. We know from McSallott's that there is no phone activity until we see the phone arrive in Arizona. We also know that the Jeep is in Arizona. So we have the burner phone and the Jeep, and Alex Cox is Googling in Arizona. Holbrook, we see that LPR reader showing the Jeep with no tire on the back, so they can open that rear window exactly as Brandon explained. This defendant's Jeep. What do we know is that, again, the burner phone is calling one person, this defendant's husband, Chad Daybell. We see that Alex Cox is in Arizona with other physical evidence. What is that? It's that receipt from Los Favoritos that was recovered inside the Jeep in Idaho. So we know the Jeep is down here. As much as the defendant wants to tell you about colors or whatever else, her Jeep was here in Mesa on October 1st of 2019. We can just stop pretending that didn't happen.
Stop pretending that didn't happen. Good job walking through again, just reminding the jury. We always say it's how they lay the case out. We're going to tell you what we're going to tell you, and we do the evidence. We tell you all the things, and then we wrap it up by telling you what we told you. And that's exactly what she's doing, is just reminding the jurors everything that's in front of them. And while still getting in a little bit of that, kind of frustration or, pointing out, I don't care if she cries. I don't care what she says. There's no evidence to back up what she just told you or what she has, and she said that in her rebuttal.
Yeah. And it was interesting, Andrea, to see, as I'm sitting in the room, we can't see the camera angle and what they're recording.
Right.
From my vantage point, I also can't see the front of Lori Vallow Daybell's face unless she's, at a certain angle. So it was interesting to me to kind of watch that back and see, the shot zoom in on her, and she's sitting there, kind of looking up, just sitting. And then at one point kind of puts her head on her hand. And, I think her body language is also really interesting. And as we've spoken to, former jurors on her case before, that, they pick up on those sorts of things, the cues, the different, maybe some of her different mannerisms and the different tones that she uses. So I wonder if the jury is not just listening to Trina K, but also looking at Vallow Daybell as she's hearing all of this being said about her.
So what about the gallery? So as she's talking and as all of this is happening, like what kind of different reactions did you get from the people? Were there different, we talked a little bit about what they did or how they reacted to Lori speaking, but what about when Trina K was presenting either her direct closing statement or her rebuttal? Was there any reaction to that, or did you notice any response in the gallery?
Yeah, as I said, Andrea, there were, and you can tell, I've been asked this before, is anyone there to support Lori? And no. The answer is essentially no. I've never met or encountered anyone who says, I think she's been wronged. In the other cases, I'm here on her side. I know other trials going on right now, Karen Reed up in the Boston area. There are people on both sides of that who think one way or the other. I haven't encountered anybody here that is trying to support Lori Vallow Daybell. So the majority of people in the gallery, and it was pretty full today, I think there were a few empty seats, are people that have been following this case. We're interested in seeing, justice play out in all of these cases here. Some people I recognize from her trial in Idaho, from her trial with, when she was convicted for conspiring to kill Charles Vallow. Former juror Tosh, we've mentioned them before. They were in the courtroom today. They, their employer gave them, 2 more days off because there was a conclusion of this case coming. And they've stated to me before just how important it is to, kind of be in those jurors' shoes and then be able to see this on the other side. And I think it's just been fascinating to Tosh to really watch this and be part of it. And they said they would definitely be there for the sentencing in the case she was just convicted of. And of course, remains to be seen if there will be a conviction in this case. But we understand if there is, then the sentencings will be conducted together, it sounds like, too. But you would ask, Andrea, I'm getting off course. I'm going on a tangent. But you had mentioned other remarks or things from the gallery. And I would say the people there, as I said, are supportive of the victims in all of these cases for the most part, or people who just are really interested to see this. So when you hear Lori get objected to time and time again, you kind of hear some snickering or like, oh my God, can you believe she just said that? Kind of those sorts of remarks or, indications with one another. A lot of these people have become friendly with one another, or they come in groups. So they're kind of not chatting loudly, obviously, but kind of just giving each other side eyes sometimes. And I'll say that when Trina K was up there were people saying being like, get her. That's kind of, I feel like that was the attitude of the people, at least in the gallery. I'm in the back row. That's where media is sitting. And the front row are the family members. So again, we had Brandon Boudreaux up there today. So we can't, again, exactly see what he's doing, saying, or feeling as he's sitting in the front there or far back. But he's been showing up each and every day, sitting right in the same spot. And as I said, I think at least one juror has been really looking in his direction. I would imagine others have been paying attention to him as well.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that juror, Tosh, that was there. They were there for they were a juror in the last case. I can only imagine their response or how different. I mean, they heard very similar statements that from the defendant and presenting that information and talking about being a victim sort of or being targeted. So it would be interesting to hear how that feels now, having been able to research and now understands a lot more about the Lori-Vallow Daybell story, the complete story, not just the story able to be presented in that trial that they watched and that they were a part of. And so did you get any response about that, or were you able to talk to them about that at all?
Yeah, Tosh said that they, wanted to see the other side of this. And it's just been striking to see the full scope of Lori-Vallow Daybell,
Sure.
because as Tosh had indicated to me before, they weren't, as the jury, able to see some of the things that happened outside the presence of the jury, whereas we're sitting in the courtroom and hearing her argue with the judge. And on that note, Andrea, I'll point out too, Vallow Daybell actually filed another motion this week. Try to stay with me here, to recuse. She asked for the judge that denied her request to recuse Judge Boreski, the current judge on the case, for that second judge that denied her motion to be recused as well. That motion was also denied. But it just goes to show that she's not really stopping her efforts here. We know this week also that an official appeal in her Idaho case was filed and laying out arguments there. And we've heard from the investigators in that case and the prosecutor, and I know maybe you can speak to this more, Andrea, but they felt like they had a strong case. They got to win with the conviction. It feels very unlikely that maybe anything would come out of an appeal effort, but it feels like that's the road we're going to be going down.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think that you're going to see lots of those in it, because that's what they do. And part of that is the process to hold, if nothing else, hold the system accountable to all of the procedures. But will they be successful? Now that is a different story. But, but seeing the appeal be filed isn't super surprising. So we are now on verdict watch. So we are they will be back tomorrow morning to begin deliberation or restart deliberation, depending on what they did this afternoon. We know they were only together a matter of minutes, but the jury comes back tomorrow morning, and then we will, of course, be there to watch. We will bring you the verdict, and we will be back here to wrap up this case once and for all after that verdict is read, and then talk about the next phase, the sentencing phase, which is what will be next if there is a conviction in this case. And even if there is not, the defendant has a conviction in the previous conspiracy to commit murder trial. So we do know there will be a sentencing. It will either be on one charge or on two. And of course, we will be here for all of that, right? And we will
absolutely, Andrea. And a quick note, I'll say a quick note for people that the judge in this case, I know we waited a while last time for the, verdict to actually be read once we get there. And in this case, he said they want to read it 20, 25 minutes. So he told everyone, if you want to hear that, stay close. So we should know pretty quickly once they reach that verdict, what the verdict is. But again, remains to be seen how much longer they'll need to deliberate. But I would be surprised, Andrea, if we didn't have a verdict by tomorrow.
I would agree as well. In fact, I would bet we might have one tomorrow morning. So we appreciate you being inside the courtroom, Erica. And of course, you, our viewers, we'll see you back here tomorrow for Inside the Courtroom, for what we believe to be the final day and the verdict in the Lori-Vallow Daybell case. So stay with us for that. We'll see you then.